In the Pacific theater of the war, the Japanese had made a lot of territorial gains in the Far East. You can see from this map. Remember, the Japanese were looking to extend their sphere of influence. In 1941, of course, they attacked the Americans at Pearl Harbor, but they were also trying to get more Pacific islands within Asia, like Singapore, parts of Thailand that were controlled by the British, and Japan is trying to prove itself as the best. They want to do this by extending control of the region. This will give them more resources, which is particularly important for the Japanese. In the Pacific theater, the war is primarily going to be fought by the American Navy and the American Marine Corps. Not so much the Army. They'll be in the European theater. And it makes sense. This is a bunch of islands. It's all about water. So, of course, the Navy and the Marine Corps will be essential. The first major battle that the Americans will be involved in is the Battle of Bataan. This is in the Philippines. You'll remember that Philippines had become American territory with the end of the Spanish-American War. And so there are American military troops stationed in the Philippines. They were led by General MacArthur. And they were pushed back, the Americans, along with help from the Filipino forces, they were pushed back and back and back until they were stuck on the Bataan Peninsula, which you can see is circled there. The American troops decided to surrender, and their leader, General MacArthur, was kind of distraught at this. He didn't want to leave his men, but knew that if he was going to be able to help continue to direct the war, he would have to escape. For the men that are captured by the Japanese, there are somewhere between 60,000 and 80,000 men, both American and Filipino prisoners of war. Once the Battle of Bataan is finished in April of 1942, they are then set on a death march, covering about 60 miles. This is particularly difficult because of the terrain, because of the climate. The Japanese treated prisoners of war abhorrently. They gave them very little food and water. Many died along the death march. If you stopped moving, you would be shot. We saw the videos of Lester Tenney talking about his experience. Then, once these prisoners of war made it to the camp, the situation was not much better. Poor hygiene, lots of dysentery and other diseases. The Red Cross was not able to access the camp to make sure that prisoners were being cared for. So this is definitely one of the most difficult episodes for the American military in World War II. Here we have another Dr. Seuss cartoon. In 1941, while we were attacked, this dastardly attack on Pearl Harbor, we assumed that because we're America, we'll be able to whip the Japanese quickly and easily. But with the Battle of Bataan and the Bataan Death March, we realized that this is going to be more difficult than perhaps we had realized. Next battle I'd like you to know about is the Battle of Coral Sea. Coral Sea is northeast of Australia, and the major issue with the Battle of the Coral Sea is the island of Papua New Guinea. Japan really wanted to maintain control of the island. For the Americans, this effort will be led by Admiral Nimitz and General MacArthur, who we just talked about. There's Admiral Nimitz. And it's really an air battle. The Japanese wanted to hold on to Port Moresby, which is the major city on Papua New Guinea. And the Japanese want to hold on to this, but their troops were not at full strength. They had already started directing a lot of their forces over to Midway Island. And America is able to intercept Japanese forces because of our code breakers. We learned about that earlier, particularly with the Navajo code breaker. So we knew that the Japanese would be in this region, and so we engage with them. The Japanese attack two of our largest boats, or two of our largest battleships, the Lexington and the Yorktown. The Lexington is completely lost. But the Japanese lose 43 planes, while the Americans lose only 33. In one sense, this is technically a victory for the Americans, for the Allies. We prevent Japan from holding on to control of Port Moresby. But it is costly for us. And so we are starting to realize that this is a different type of warfare than we are used to. So part of the reason the Americans are able to be victorious is because, as I said earlier, that the Japanese were not at full strength at Coral Sea because so many had already been directed to Midway. Midway is about midway between North America and the Pacific. The original plan by the Japanese was to paralyze American forces, but again, we intercepted messages and we could be prepared ahead of time. This is in June of 1942, and even though we've only been in the war for a few months, we consider it a turning point because we're starting to figure out how to fight against the Japanese as an enemy. 4 of Japan's largest aircraft carriers are destroyed, including many that had been involved at getting planes close enough to Pearl Harbor. We also destroyed a Japanese cruiser, and the Americans only lost 2 vessels. And what we're seeing with this battle is that American industry is better equipped than the Japanese to handle this scale of warfare. Remember, Japan's a pretty small island, not a lot of resources, and we have capabilities that Japan doesn't necessarily have. Shortly following the Battle of Midway, we have the Battle of Guadalcanal. This is still sort of part of the campaign of Japan trying to take Australia, or at least trying to cut it off from supplies. Guadalcanal was pretty essential just because of its size, had a significant airfield on it. And airfields are going to be hugely important in this war. The Americans are able to hold on to this. The most famous hero of this battle is John Basilone. He was able to hold off 3,000 Japanese soldiers with just one other guy. He's given the Medal of Honor. And we realize with this a tactic, island hopping. This is what's going to be necessary in order to get close to the Japanese. We're not going to be able to cover ground like we did in the First World War or like troops would be attempting in Europe. We are going to need to get airfields. This would be essential, and hopefully work our way towards Japan and get close enough so that we could launch an invasion. In the fall of 1943, there is the Battle of Tarawa, also known as Bloody Tarawa. In this case, the Japanese were expecting the American amphibious attack, and they had been preparing the island for almost a year. And so this was extremely costly for the Americans. About 1,700 were killed, over 2,000 wounded, and this will lead to the importance of what will become the Navy SEALs. Having a force, having a unit that specifically can prepare for amphibious assaults, can check out, are there any, I guess, booby traps, you would call them, anything that could inhibit the American progress. In the summer and fall of 1944, we're finally going to get to see this island hopping tactic start to really come into effect. So we had the Battle of Midway. That was a successful battle for the Americans. From there, in taking over that airfield, they were able to go to from Midway, we were able to go to Tarawa, which was very costly. From there, we go to Guam and Saipan. So this is now caught up to 1944. At Saipan, this took place just 1 week after the D-Day landings. And one thing that happens at Saipan is the largest banzai attack. We talked about banzai meaning sort of these almost suicide attacks where the soldiers will run at the enemy and sacrifice themselves in order to do damage. We do take back Guam, which we had received as part of the settlement of the Spanish-American War. What's important about Guam and Saipan, though, is that it is 1,300 miles from Japan. That means it is within range of our B-29 bombers. So this part, remember, island hopping is getting close enough to bomb Japan and then also to launch an invasion. Next, we have Peleliu. Peleliu is an island that's really just made of coral. We need it for the airstrip. Again, has been fortified by the Japanese, and we experience heavy losses. Not nearly as bad as the Japanese, but this is a very costly campaign. Then, in the fall of 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. This is in the Philippines. And this is where the Japanese begin carrying out the kamikaze attacks, where the pilots will sort of suicide dive bomb the American ships. The purpose is to try and disarm American power, but it is also showing Japanese, they're desperate. They really are realizing that they cannot compete against the American war machine. The Americans are successful in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and Japanese naval power is shrunk even further. Then we get into 1945, and you see that next jump is getting a bit closer to Japan, and that is Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima is about 500, just under 600 miles from Japan. It is an uninhabited island, volcanic, nothing there of value. It's just its location. The Japanese knew that this would be important, so they had sent over 20,000 soldiers to defend this island, and they had been digging a series of tunnels and caves in the volcanic mountains. American planes bombard the island for days, and then the Marines land. And we have the famous photograph of the Marines raising the flag at Mount Suribachi. It does take several weeks for us to secure the island, but we only take, out of those 23,000 Japanese, we only take 1,000 prisoners. The rest died in battle or committed suicide. So we're seeing this Japanese mentality of fighting to the death rather than surrendering. Again, very costly. We lose almost 6,000 men, about 17,000 wounded. So all of this tactic of island hopping is very, very costly, and it starts informing what might need to happen next. The final step of the island hopping campaign is the Battle of Okinawa. This battle lasts for almost 3 months in early 1945. This is characterized by banzai attacks, by kamikaze attacks. It is a somewhat heavily populated island. That means there will be a great civilian cost. About 100,000 civilians were killed in the midst of this battle. About 12,000 American forces were killed. So again, very, very costly for us. But that's because the way the Japanese are fighting, with those kamikaze and those banzai attacks, the Japanese Empire is realizing the closer we get to them, that the harder they will fight. Again, that Japanese mentality of fight to the death. They are using suicide bombers. We saw a clip of that in class. And so it really is the Battle of Okinawa that forces Americans, the American leadership, to figure out, do we want to invade Japan? And the decision is made, no, it would be too costly because we see what we would go up against. Not only would we be risking American lives, but the civilian population of Japan would also be severely hurt.